Welcome to Association Chat, an online discussion where we warm ourselves by the virtual fire with the topics of the day. We're welcoming thought leaders and trailblazers alike to join up in this online home for the community. I'm struggling there, but we're getting started. I'm the host of Association Chat, Kiki L'Italienne, and maybe you've noticed that things are a little bit different. I don't know, something in the air, but look, part of the challenge that we've been faced with is figuring out how to do some of the things that were already a little bit difficult and to do them remotely, right? So how do we handle things like having difficult discussions, solving complicated problems, or maybe making knowledge-based decisions when we are at a distance or experiencing sort of a hybrid kind of environment with our leaders? Well, that's what we're talking about today. Today's guests are Tecker and Leigh Wintz. These are two phenomenal minds. I love them so much. I enjoy talking with each of them. They are full of wonderful stories. They have excellent experience, and they guide people, leaders and their teams in strategy, but also making these knowledge-based decisions. So as I welcome them up, I want you to be thinking about some of your own challenges that you've been facing and thinking about maybe some of the questions that you have with making decisions with your teams. Okay, so up on deck. Hey, Glenn. Hey, Leigh.
Good to see you, Kiki.
Hi, Kiki.
How'd I do with that intro? Was it okay? I was kind of like, yeah, I'm hyper caffeinated right now, so I just have to explain that right out of the gate.
I think you've made some very good decisions about the introduction.
I'm off to a good start. That's good news. Okay. Yeah. So, Leigh, I wanted to actually start with you right away and just say, why is this such an important topic for us to talk about about leaders, today? Why is this such an important thing to learn about?
Well, leadership has always been a passion of mine. I started out with an interest in women in leadership when that was kind of a new thing. We're finding out that the skills we need as leaders today involve making knowledge-based decisions, good decisions. And we've been in this pandemic situation long enough now that leaders are finding some of the decisions that were made maybe didn't work out so well, and maybe you need to rethink them or redo them. So the whole process of leading all of the time, but particularly during these stretched out, chaotic times, has really made me stop to think about the process of how we come to good decisions and how we feel confidence as CEOs and as senior staff of not-for-profit organizations.
Yeah, one of the questions that I know that we've been grappling with, and I'm going to go ahead and put the website down, tecker.com. We're all connected to tecker.com. One of the questions we've been grappling with has been this question of how to lead people and leaders specifically in working with their teams to make better decisions. Why has the pandemic specifically, why has this remote aspect of it been causing this to be a more difficult problem than before?
I think it's all about engagement. Whether you're talking your senior staff or certainly engagement of the board. When there are so many personal things going on outside, as a community, we've always been involved, and we called it networking, but it's about those relationships. And remote works fine for a short period of time, but I cannot believe how difficult it has been to maintain those relationships. And we've seen an erosion of trust just by virtue of the fact that we're having to meet remotely.
Yeah. What I'd also add to the issue of engagement is the issue of coherency. A decision is not made in isolation of other decisions. And one of the things that's happened in the virtual environment is our conversations that have led to decisions tend to be sporadic. The good news is there's lots of time to think about things in between each of those discussions. The bad news is there's lots of time to forget what you talked about in the last discussion before you get to the next one. So we are seeing many decisions that are being made in reasonable fashion, but in isolation of other decisions they are related to. You combine that with engagement and the disengagement of some individuals, which is very natural, and it creates a bit of a double whammy in terms of sustaining momentum over time. Last couple of weeks ago, I had a chance to be part of a conversation with a neuroscientist and an anthropologist and a psychologist. And part of what the conversation was about was their hypothesis that the human brain is not hardwired to work in a two-dimensional environment where decision making involves something like trust, which Leigh just mentioned. It's very difficult for the human brain to arrive at a conclusion that trust should be afforded if the human brain is only able to use two of its senses. So the vehicle that we are ending up using has built into it extra difficulty in people having feelings about the judgments they're making. Well, that's always been a problem for individuals, but it multiplies itself when it's necessary for a group to have a collective feeling about a judgment or decision it's made. So in order to do that, you've got to spend more time with the information. Leigh?
I think we've been engaged in this kind of having to keep the ship running long enough that where people are now starting to forget why they were made certain decisions, or it's been asynchronous in the way, if you weren't involved in that short 30 to 90 minute session where everybody was in agreement about that, and you don't have time to document it well enough, people are starting to rethink, well, why did we decide that? Why are we doing that? And some boards that I've been working with, the CEO is thinking that the board is too much in the weeds, when really they're just trying to get context for the decisions that were right. They're not questioning what was done, but they're kind of questioning, I don't remember why we did this.
Wow. And that is such an important point, because I think because of the times we're in, the remarkable times that we're in, Glenn, because of the remarkable times that we're in, a lot of decisions have had to either, maybe not, they haven't had to be rushed to be made, but there are so many different considerations that people have now that maybe when the discussion started, they didn't. There are new problems that they have to solve, and priorities have shifted.
And so, I think the pace is something that nobody anticipated, that we would have to sustain this pace. And when you were dependent on knowing people in your particular culture, and let's face it, for most of us, the reason volunteers are volunteering in their not-for-profit organization is because they want to meet and get to know the experts in the field, the smart people in the field that are serving on the board. So they're not questioning the expertise, but they're missing that body of working together that just doesn't come across when we're having a conversation like this. There's only three of us.
Yeah.
And when you add all those pieces up, one of the observations that I would share is I believe a large proportion of conversations related to decision making are far less robust than they used to be. They are far less informed than they used to be. The culture of inquiry that has always been a characteristic of good decision-making groups has been diluted by the requirement that we work in short bursts of time in a two-dimensional environment. And what that suggests is that more attention to a carefully designed process to ensure that the decisions are based upon carefully vetted pieces of information that have been shared by the full group becomes more important than ever before. The term is one of those terms that gets overused today, but the process for decision making needs to be more intentional than it has been in the past, because the organic nature of decision making in groups like association boards or houses of delegates or committees has been very much truncated by the requirement that we operate within this flat environment with each other.
And to some of the boards that are used to more robust, strategic, knowledge-based decisions, this has felt like too long in the react and ratify mode. So we're getting either a committee, an executive committee is in charge and really making those decisions, or staff is, and there's a lack of confidence in the competence of their partners, which has always been part of a knowledge-based organization, and the kind that we've been going for years.
Yeah. You know? Yeah.
Okay.
The upside of shorter bursts in the decision-making process ought to be the opportunity that you have for deeper or broader conversation with perhaps even a larger population that occurs in between those short bursts of the decision-making group coming together. But people are still using old technologies to do that, relying upon your emails or even audio conferences to take advantage of that, rather than having a rubric that they can use to consciously gather information that informs the decision. And we're not just talking about data scientists and database decision making, talking about knowledge-based decision making. Mm-hmm. And part of that is data, but part of it is also informed intuition. Part of it's experience and expertise. And we're seeing methodologies growing now that allow for large groups to participate in a more intentional fashion in conversation about those issues. So the ultimate decision makers have a broader and deeper knowledge base to rely upon in order to ultimately make the judgments. It involves using asynchronous and synchronous meetings in order to create that information base. The information base, what you need to know about, remains the same. What's different now is the methodologies that are available for gathering and curating that information so that the decision makers can take it into account.
So this is really important for everyone to be hearing, okay? Because right now we're not talking about someone who is just new on the scene, and you know, Glenn and Leigh, that you've worked with a couple of really important clients, and you have years and years of working with clients where you've seen about every different type of situation cross in front of you. And now you're saying, okay, this is kind of, this is a unique experience or a unique situation now where a lot of these old ways of thinking are not going to cut it now. And it's very important to figure out, you know, how to adapt and evolve to have, you know, and enable better decision making. That's what I'm hearing.
And
absolutely.
It's also going to affect the very people that you're asking to serve on a board or to become the senior leadership of a staff. There's a different skill set. The foundations are all still there, but how we're arriving at those decisions and how we're feeling part of a team that's moving forward requires a different set of skill set and experience now. We're in this too long. It's never going to be the way it was. So we all need to go into this in an intentional way about what can we do to keep those good fundamentals going, but use the new technology.
Yeah, we're trying to navigate through what is essentially a paradox. The paradox is that the requirements of decision making, both legal and as a discipline, have not changed. The duty of care, which essentially means that a group like a board needs to demonstrate due diligence in its thinking, still is present as a requirement for organized decision-making groups. The ability to demonstrate that you've actually taken defensible information into account, not just opinions. To be able to demonstrate that you've considered alternatives. To be able to demonstrate you've looked at the advantages and disadvantages of each alternative. And then the duty of loyalty. To be able to demonstrate that ultimately you made a decision on the basis of what's in the best interest of the organization. That hasn't changed. What also has not changed are the things that you need to know about in order to have confidence in the decision. The needs, wants, and preferences of the stakeholders, the current conditions, the trends, some projections about the future, the capacity and strategic position of the organization. In today's world, more than ever, the ethical dimensions of the issues. So you add that all up, and what we're finding now is the need to create methodologies to gather and curate the information in different ways than we were able to do when there were just 15 to 20 of us sitting together in a room around the table. The opportunities are immense in areas that most people don't even think about. For example, in the areas of diversity, inclusion, and equity, we now have the ability to not be limited to the views of individuals who are able to make it to the board table. We're now able to carefully and consciously and assertively gather information from all of the perspectives that are important to us. So the technologies actually break down barriers, which we now realize have either consciously or unconsciously biased the information basis that we had previously. So while it's new for folks, I'm prepared to say that it's new and better. If I was building a new laundry detergent, on the box it would say new and better. You know,
yeah. What I think
new and improved. Yeah.
has made a lot of groups look at is the amount of, if anybody still had fat in their agenda and the board was given things to deal with that really weren't important, or it really was a rubber stamp, forget it. Everybody's willing to let but you've got to have your vision so clear and the direction about where you're going that all those parts can go ahead and get the work done. And that's the part that we need to do better at, and have better technology available to gather those perspectives, but then just decide.
One of the things we've been saying for some time is recognizing the need to reorganize how we get work done as an organization to fit the realities of our members' world, rather than asking our members to fit the traditional reality of how we've made decisions. And an additional value of this emerging technology is it allows for conversation and organized, facilitated decision-making, different place, different time, not just same place, same time. So literally individuals whose lives, as Leigh's just described, are more complicated and concerning than ever before because of the remarkable times that we're in, actually have additional control over when they can find the discretionary time to voluntarily participate in the process of decision making. So that also opens up the opportunity to be more democratic, so to speak, in our information gathering.
Well, I love this because, so often, and I sent, just so everyone knows, a little glimpse behind the curtain of, what happens to sort of put these episodes together. I sent a little heads up, I'll probably ask these questions to Leigh and Glenn ahead of time. And if, in case you didn't know, they've worked together for years. They
30 years.
30 years, last count.
Is that really true?
Yes.
How long?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, one of our friends, the two of our friends at ASAE, Susan Robertson and Pam Troop, reminded us this year on Facebook that Leigh and I have been working together for 30 years.
30 years.
And you've written together.
I was a mere 2 years old when we started.
Yes, I know. So
and I just turned 60.
But it's fascinating because I send these questions ahead of time, and obviously unnecessary, because this could just be the ongoing organic conversation forever, but when you're talking about some of what you have observed in the challenges that the leaders are facing today, are you hearing that leaders, I'm going back to the comment about trust and this necessity to sort of prove your decision-making abilities along the way so that people have greater trust in you. Are you hearing feedback from leaders right now that, or not feedback, but insight questions where they're saying, yeah, my board has more questions than they used to, and I don't feel like they trust in me, or I'm getting a sense that I don't have the buy-in like I used to. Are you hearing that that's a thing more now?
Yes,
and we're finding it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is, as I mentioned earlier, the human brain is not hardwired for trust to occur. If you're in a two-dimensional environment, you can't read things like you do. And the reason it relates to trust is what those folks were talking about in terms of hardwiring goes all the way back to every mammal having to make a decision about whether fight or flight.
Yeah.
And basically it's, am I secure? And that's what trust comes from. So they're unable to make that decision because some of the senses aren't there. The other side of the same sword that we're observing is sometimes disengagement is being misconstrued as trust, and action is being taken with insufficient shared understanding of the decision. So what I mean by that is a lot of the board members, for example, are so involved with their own issues, their family issues, their personal issues, their business issues. They're disengaging to some extent from their responsibilities as a decision-making group. And what Leigh and I have both observed in our work with clients is an increase in the willingness of boards to delegate to smaller groups the accountability and authority to make decisions. So some decisions that a board used to want to make on its own, now it's delegated to officers. And some decisions officers wanted always to make on their own has now been delegated to the staff. Well, the concern is that because this is being accomplished not because of trust, but because of disengagement, what's likely to happen if it turns out the decision was wrong? Well, they have offloaded any shared accountability for it.
Right.
So guess what's going to happen to the individual who picked up the cudgel to move forward with it? That, in our judgment, also makes documentation of the rationale behind the decision that much more important for those who are going to be held accountable for it.
The quality and the quantity of background information that needs to be provided to these groups, a board in particular, has got to be different. Even in the organizations that did that well, they did it well on a big decision and they took the time. But I'm still seeing way too much board background material for a Zoom board meeting. I look at the agenda and I go, you don't have the airplane to ride on to look at the board book anymore.
I mean, I'm laughing. I know you're dead serious, but
I am deadly serious.
We know that's true. We know it's true.
From the committee or the staff members' point that's put that information out and slaved over that background material, they get insulted, when it's obvious, when it's time for the decision that, well, didn't you see that on page 42? Well, no, because I don't have time to read anything anymore. Yeah. So they need it in small chunks and they need it when they need it.
The importance of what we've always called optimum information load has magnified in this environment. Yeah. That's what information, how much information, and in what format. And that's where a knowledge-based rubric also assists. And Kiki, I know you and I have had experience in our work with associations and in building a trusting culture, where we found ourselves giving advice that's contradictory to advice we used to give about communication.
Yes.
We used to tell people, just communicate progress towards outcomes. Don't talk about the groups you visited, the speeches you gave, the number of things you wrote, the number of visits to the Hill and what the conversation was. Because if you talk about how you're doing stuff, the board is going to want to talk about how you're doing stuff. If you're talking about progress towards the achievement of important outcomes, the board's going to want to talk about the achievement of important outcomes.
Right.
But now what we have observed to folks is because of the disconnects that are occurring, you really need to be communicating a higher level of detail more frequently than ever before. You need to tell people about all that you're doing so that they understand, especially since now you're working from home, that you're actually working on their behalf.
And I don't know.
That's their source of comfort.
I don't know a single group that I've worked with recently. I don't know a one that doesn't have staff that is like so burning out at this point. They are working so hard for such a long period of time. And so that also kind of gets people's hackles up when it appears that the board member didn't read your, or the officer didn't, or the committee didn't read this wonderful material that you stayed up all night, putting together for them in a shorter time frame. And the other thing that's happened that I'm reminded of in leadership, it was something I learned from a board member when email was not the routine that it is now. And there's always the one board member or the one staff member that you see something in email. We've all gotten over the fact that, it isn't the same as talking to someone on the phone. But the one email where you just see who it's from and you already cringe. Well, I'm seeing a lot more of that going on, and I'm encouraging other leaders to imagine the person that they like hearing from. Imagine that this idea or this question came from that person, not from the person that you go, I don't know why I opened this at 11 o'clock at night.
It is. There's a lot of responsibility on all of us to create. There always has been, to create boundaries, right? To create boundaries between, our personal lives and our professional lives so that we don't get burnout. But boy, it seems like we're being tested on that between what's been going on last year and what's still going on, right?
And I know for most people that are working this hard, and this is particularly from my women colleagues that I'm hearing, it's almost a relief to be able to go do email or do work at what's at your discretion, but you still have that whole personal side of maybe sitting on a decision or maybe replying to something that I think has been manifested even more. You can't just say, okay, this is family time, this is home time. And if your kid is sick and you're in the house with him, it's different than come pick him up at daycare. It's wild, and everybody's got these kinds of things going on. So it's hard to take a board to task for appearing disengaged when really they might need to be. We need to be giving people more space and allowing them to check out on personal things, and we'll get back to you when the decision is made. So that documentation piece is so important. Carly's
noted in the chat, it doesn't feel like there are any boundaries anymore.
Right.
There are still boundaries, except now they're not made of bricks. Now they're a porous membrane.
Right.
Because at the same time, you can be in multiple places. And that's a piece of what happens, we are finding, in the virtual environment, where I believe the expression is you need to be present. Well, people are in multiple places at the same time. And one of the observations that Leigh and I would share in our work with clients is in that virtual environment, we are seeing some of the traditional flaws in decision-making occurring more frequently with no one asking the hard question that tends to negate their effect. We see a lot of overconfidence in decision making because people in this remarkable environment are drawn to the things they can wrap their arms around. They want to talk about the tangible because they can control that. We're seeing a lot of status quo bias. Well, we've done it before that way. Let's figure out a new way to do it, exactly the same thing in the same way, but in this new environment. And it doesn't always fit. We're seeing a lot of herding instinct. What I mean by that is people who are very quickly pretending to agree with what's being proposed rather than asking the hard question. What would happen if? What's the risk here? Is there a downside? So they're moving to false consensus simply because as humans, there is a limit on their intellectual, emotional, and physical capacity to sit in the same chair in front of a Brady Bunch screen for a period of time. So you add all of this up, and in the course of trying to make decisions about complex issues, we've got other sources of anxiety developing at the same time. So to deal with that, the more facilitated you can become, the more structured you become in the process, the more consistency that you bring in process, flexible enough to handle very different content, the more likely it is that your membership, your leaders, and the group that you're part of are going to feel comfortable and rewarded as a result of the time that they spend.
I'm going to take, oh, sorry about that. Didn't mean to cut you off, Glenn.
That's okay.
I want to take a little moment to just say thank you to the Patreon patrons who support Association Chat. If you are getting a lot of value from this, and by the way, yes, both Leigh and Glenn are Patreon patrons of Association Chat. So they see value in it. Don't you want to be like Glenn and Leigh? If you see, if
Please, no.
This is our Blake Sheldon move.
then please consider supporting this work on Patreon. Wow. Okay. So with that said, I also wanted to bring up, one of the benefits of doing all of this live, which is a very important thing that we do these interviews live, because I want all of you to have a chance to ask your questions. Thomas made a comment. He said, it's true that email is a slippery slope, an emotional roller coaster moving from what did they say at the subject line to they said what after the open. And it's such a good point.
I personally miss the water cooler, but it can certainly happen over email, even better. and I, if you're going to do that, please liberally use emoticons, because the words just don't hack it anymore. They
don't. We really rely on our emojis and emoticons and just about anything that will add a little human element, a little feeling into all of this, right? So,
when you're dealing with a complex decision, you're dealing it with both the cognitive and the affective side, particularly in a voluntary membership organization. It's not just that the decision has to be right. The decision needs to be explainable in terms that have meaning to the individuals who need to understand and support that decision. One of the worst places to try and communicate at that level is through email.
Yeah.
Yes. And I'm sure we all have horror stories of how relatively simple communication, there was no ill intent, that to kick things off, but that things got horribly off track because somebody came across the email at the wrong time or misinterpreted.
I tie it back to decision making.
Yes.
And one of the things that we are observing, I don't know how to say this gently, so I'll just say it directly. There's a dumbing down in conversations. Yeah. They're getting simplistic. They're getting shortened in terms of both breadth and depth. And if communications is about not just sending, but receiving and understanding, we're seeing significant dilution of that occurring in the because of the way in which communication is being forced to be undertaken now.
Mm-hmm. I am puzzled by a couple of things that are going on, because Glenn and I are the older generation on here, and we've long since adapted to the technology. And I really don't think there are that many people that can't use the association's website to get a video message from the chairman of the board. 2-3 minutes announcing some of these decisions that don't bring up the questions. So I think in some ways we need to relook at that. We can't go out and do the visits to chapters or regions or whatever the components were. But why aren't we making use of this and spending more time with our communication experts? And it's another skill that board members are going to have. And I can't tell you the number of groups where we've set up a board meeting or a training of some kind on Zoom, and I have to tell some of them, I like your video on. Oh, well, we don't make people turn their video on. Well, then why are we doing a video teleconference? And I understand not everybody's an extrovert like I am, and we'll deal with this. But it's got to be a skill set that your volunteer leadership has got to be able to use. And if you need to give them training, give them training.
Yeah. Working in a virtual environment, as Leigh alluded, is not new for us. As a practice, we've been working with each other in a virtual environment and with our clients in a virtual environment for over 20 years.
Right.
It was almost 25 years ago when Leigh and I had a first hybrid meeting, quote unquote. We didn't know that's what you call it at the time, but we had the staff in one location and we had members of the board participating in Skype. If anyone remembers what Skype is, it's kind of like Lotus Notes and and MySpace and So one of the things that we're observing now is just when folks are getting used to the virtual environment, we're getting ready to move into a hybrid space, where some folks are face-to-face, some folks are virtual. Now, we've already discovered what the so-called trick is to make that work, and that is that the folks who are face-to-face, as well as the folks that are virtual, need to be participating using their laptops.
I want to pause.
Whether you're in the room or not in the room, you're having the same experience with each other.
Okay, I want to pause right there, because I really think that everyone who's listening to this, whether it's live or later when you're listening to this recording, I think this is super important for you to hear, because you have tested this out. We've tested this out. This is so true. If you are in a situation where you are going to have a hybrid meeting, it's important for you to understand that for those people who are participating, and we're talking here about people who are interacting with each other.
Correct. They're not just passively getting information. They're working with each other to make a decision.
Yes. And so it's not like your typical virtual events or anything like, not typical, but you know what I'm saying. Not virtual events as you hear
or imparting education. Yeah.
Right. So this is for people who are working together and they need to interact and they need to engage with each other. Do not make the mistake of thinking that one person in front of the room and none of those people, all of them on the same camera, that's going to be the most effective way to do these types of meetings, right? I want to explore this in depth because people are looking for, how do I do this? What works and doesn't. And a lot of times we don't know until we actually get into the thick of it.
If we have a hybrid meeting, the purpose of which is not learning per se, not a webinar,
right?
But the purpose of which is for the group to actually get work done together while they're together, then you cannot successfully have one group participating virtually and the other group getting the work done while they're sitting together at the table. So the question then becomes, what is it that you need to create the same experience for both, regardless of where they're located? This is where evolving technology has now provided us with a solution, which are mechanism software platforms that are designed not for education programs, not for a conference, not for an exhibit hall, but for group work to occur, the purpose of which is to produce a product or a decision. And if we employ those, that creates the bridge for those who want the social experience at working with those who either don't or are unable to. In fact, we've become so affectionate towards these platforms on, let me think of the date, February 2nd.
Yes,
We're
yes.
actually providing an opportunity for folks to have some experience, to explore the use of these technologies.
Let me get this up. I'm so proud of myself for having this, Glenn. Okay, so I had this ready to go. I even made a bit.ly link, and everyone can check this out. You have a little bit of time to get signed up, because we're going to do a live workshop, an intro kickoff, I should say, next Tuesday. And you have time to register and get involved in this. But we're actually going to show people how it's done, how you can do asynchronous and synchronous
in a well-organized and facilitated fashion. This is a software.
You don't have to learn a whole new program to do this.
Yeah,
right,
if you can do Facebook and Zoom, you can use this.
Yeah.
The backstory is this particular software was developed for use in facilitation of group decision making. So it has built into it all of the knowledge that we have about how effective group work is accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot different than the traditional webinar. In fact, a little backstory, and it will make both Leigh and Kiki smile, is there was a conversation, well, what the heck do we call this? And one of the suggestions was, well, let's call it an engaginar. It's not a webinar, it's an engaginar. But it was a split vote on whether to call it that or not. So I think we're calling it an exploration. But
you know what? It is an exploration. It's a learning journey for all of us. But there is. I'm just going to warn you that for some of the promotions I put together for it, I did use the word engaginar because it's catchy. It's memorable. It's not great, I know, but it is catchy.
Yeah, it's awkward but accurate.
Awkward but accurate.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the impact of this technological support tool on decision making in groups, particularly as it relates to communities of decision makers, like an association, it's enormous. We can easily envision this replacing houses of delegates.
Yeah.
We can easily envision this being the way that committees get work done without the expense of multiple face-to-face meetings and travel. We can easily envision this as a mechanism for boards to be able to continue their governance work over time with more effective use of the time that occurs in between the face-to-face, whether it's in virtual space or actual space. So the potential here is unlimited in terms of its utility.
I really like it for the decision making and the way you can build on one another's work. But I have a side project going on making sure that the virtual cocktail hour is really what it should be. Even having drinks at the same time with somebody is just not the same. So we still need to get some technology going on that virtual cocktail party. So
yeah, and I know we've got a vote of support for Engaginar from Jen.
Yes,
who coincidentally is the author of Engaging Virtual Meetings.
Yes. He is the guy, the go-to person that you want to talk to about figuring out. He would have an answer for the virtual cocktail party.
I want to hear it.
I know. But seriously, I mean, even karaoke. John Chen's the man. You got to check it out. But you should also check out Better Together Chat here, the bit.ly link, better-together-chat.
I've discovered that virtual cocktail hours are successful dependent upon how much you end up drinking in the time.
Oh, true.
The greater the amount of alcohol you consume, the more delightful the virtual engagement is.
It
And
is
the
so
better the
dangerous.
decision. The better decisions.
It's so dangerous because if you think about it, being where you can blast out your communication to anyone after, like, I'm just going to work a little bit after your virtual cocktail hour. Here's a little piece of advice from me to you is just, that's a boundary moment. You create your personal boundary. You have your virtual cocktail hour, and then give yourself some time, some breathing room, and maybe not post to social media while you're feeling inspired.
Yeah, and behaving in that fashion does have implications for the quality of the decision making.
Very true.
Over the course of time, we have observed that there are really 5 characteristics, 4 tough ones, of decisions that are effective.
Mm-hmm.
The 4 are quality. What that means is when you look back at the critical decisions you've made, they've turned out to be the right course of action. That's the best indicator you can get that, in fact, the methodology that you've been employing is effective methodology, that you have a history of decisions that were the right ones. The second is speed. And that's that you're able to make those critical decisions with a sufficient pace. You don't find yourself arriving at a decision to do something after 3 other people have already done it. You don't find yourself allowing, as Leigh would call it, paralysis by analysis.
Yes.
Stretching out the decision process to the point where the window of opportunity has closed. So speed is another characteristic. The third is yield. And that is that the decision has been sufficiently supported and understood where it is actually executed the way it's intended to be, that it doesn't get lost. And remember the kids' game Whispering Down the Lane, wherever somebody would come up with a story and you tell the person next to you, and then they had to tell the person next to them.
It's like telephone, right?
Yeah, like
right, same game.
Okay.
By the time you got to the end, there was no connection at all between the first story and what you ended up hearing at the end. Well, the same thing happens with decisions when they stretch out too long. The yield is not there because by the time it goes through all the layers of bureaucracy, it's not executed the way it was originally intended. So the decision process has to be clear. The fourth one is effort. And that is essentially you've put in the right amount of effort. You can't just make a decision and hope that it will work its way out. One of Leigh's favorite expressions is hope is not a strategy.
Right.
So a piece of this is having a decision process where the folks whose support you are dependent upon for the decision to be effectively executed understand and support that decision. And the best way to get understanding and support of the decision is to provide for meaningful involvement. Traditional decision-making processes that were compressed into a particular time for a relatively small group who you hoped would be representative of the larger population made it very difficult for understanding and support to occur throughout all those whose behaviors the decision was dependent upon for its success. This is another opportunity that the new tools enable. They're not replacements for face-to-face, not at all. But what they are ways of allowing the decision-making group to spend its physical time together using information to make the decision, rather than spending its time together gathering the information. Leigh knows the story because she lived through the same meeting, the worst board meetings we have ever been to before we got the board to change its culture. Is the first half of the board meeting is spent with committee reports and staff reports where the board is passively sitting, listening to people explain stuff that's already been done. And then the conscious chair, the good chair, makes sure that everybody gets their chance to talk. So the chair works his or her way around the table with each person indicating what they would have done differently if they had been in charge. And then the group goes home. Well, when you haven't collected the information, when you haven't made the decision process knowledge based, you have little choice but to have a meeting that operates that way. So part of what's going on is creating efficiency. John says worst board meetings.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're board meetings, BORE.
BOREE.
Yes, yes, and here he's saying, here's your happy hour. Yeah.
So what's fascinating is, even though we have these, like everything else we have learned during these remarkable times, there are tremendous challenges, but those challenges have produced some innovations in 9 months that otherwise would have taken 9 years.
That's
We're
right.
right now at that point in the Gantt chart of new innovation where folks are just starting to become aware of it. And becoming aware of it is the step before it becomes easily accessible and affordable. So the time now to begin thinking about how will we in fact execute effective decision making when we move to the hybrid environment as the normal, as opposed to seeing it as the future. This is the time that leaders of associations need to be thinking about that, in our judgment. The character of good decision making is the same. What you need to know is the same. The steps that you go through the same. But the pipeline through which things are going to pass is now very different than it's ever been before.
As is the communication of the decisions that are made.
Yeah. And that's actually a really great point. And I would like to, as we round out the hour, I would like to maybe talk a little bit about that communication aspect of it too, because once you've made the decision, you get through the point that you make the decision, this communication about the decision is also important. True?
Yeah, for years, long before we were in this environment, we always advised board, especially if it was a controversial decision or it took you longer to get there. You got to the right place, but it took a while, and and you've addressed, there are going to be some segments of the membership or some stakeholder that's going to feel disenfranchised. Take a few minutes right after that decision is made and talk about the communication plan. It honestly doesn't take 2 minutes. If you've thought about it ahead of time and you've got your communication channels, who should they who are the spokespeople in your organization when a decision like that has been made, and give the board members, who are now more than ever sitting there with a device that can immediately broadcast, even on social media, a decision that the board has just been made. Before they hit those phones, be sure to give them the words. What's the 30-second soundbite that you're going to say about the decision that we made?
You don't want the first contact with that decision to be with a tweet that has been sent from the meeting in the middle of the conversation. And if you're really doing it well, you're communicating not just the decision, but what the rationale for the decision was. And if you're doing it especially well, that rationale is always framed in terms of the value or benefit that will accrue to mission or member as a result of the choice that's been made. How will this make the world different in a better way as a result of what we've decided? But Kiki, you're our expert in communication, so I'm going to be Kiki, and I would say, Kiki, what advice would you give to people about how to communicate complex decisions?
Well, and the thing that I would come back, and thank you for that. You did a wonderful job as me. It's actually really, really impressive.
Thank you. Watch me fix my hair.
We were having a conversation earlier today, and I love poetry and literature. I've been listening to a lot of it lately, just to listen to just to hear the sounds, right? And we were talking about simplicity of message, and I thought about haiku. And really, I think that there are a couple of themes that for all communication that people need to think about, especially right now. And one is simplicity, and the other one is truth, right? And so it's extremely important right now with so many complicated issues that are impacting people in all facets of our lives, right? It's extremely important to focus on simplicity and really providing clarity in your message and honesty, really trying to convey truth, so that you are someone that people can trust, and that you are someone who's conveying a message that others understand. And I think that's probably the very best that we can do in communicating anything, but especially in communicating something that has been a decision that's moving an organization forward, is really, trying to make sure that you're coming across as clear and with as much authenticity and honesty as you can.
So pardon the pun, but I think the advice you just gave is a simple truth.
A simple truth. The wind beckons. I'm trying to remember what is it? 575? Is that the way it goes? Yeah. Yeah. And actually, Glenn Tecker wins the Kiki Italian impersonation contest of the year. So I want to thank you both for joining me today. I do have one final question, and I will start with you, Leigh. What should our listeners do first thing after listening to this session today? What's the very next thing they should do?
Make a decision about how they're going to make their next big decision.
Was that clear? That was clear.
That was a simple truth.
That was a simple truth. Glenn, your thoughts?
I can't top that one.
Yeah, I know.
I would add to it, that's all. If you get the opportunity to expose yourself to some of the technologies that we have been talking about that constitute solutions to some of the disadvantages which we inherited along with the advantages in moving complex decision making into virtual space, I would encourage you to take that opportunity.
Yes. So I'm going to actually, first we have to say, Judy says, thank you all. And I want to say, thank you, Judy, for tuning in. So let's make sure we give Judy some recognition there. And then I'm also going to throw the link, the bit.ly link to, so people can actually sign on and register and experience a little bit of this knowledge-based decision-making, go through this experience with us and see what we're talking about. Because, if you are maybe wanting to learn a little bit more about this is an exercise, a journey that you're going to be able to take and explore and then take back to your organizations. And it's completely free. So this is your opportunity to participate in that. And with that, thank you so much. Say bye. Bye. And I'm kicking them off, but it's so hard for me to do it because weren't they phenomenal? All right. So as always, I just want to thank everyone for participating with Association Chat and being a part of our show. If you have any questions, always feel free to reach out. Participate in this really nifty, it's going to be I want to say exceptional. We'll see. I think it's going to be an extraordinary experience that you can take part in. Again, I want to thank Glenn and Leigh for being on here. And as always, I want you to keep asking questions to learn every day, because as Joseph Campbell once said, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. Have a great rest of the week, everyone.